today. So hello, everyone. Welcome to our monthly installment of the Midwest Climate Adaptation Science Center's Science Seminar. I'm Melissa Welch, and I am the Program Manager for the Midwest CASC based at the University of Minnesota in partnership with our federal partner, USGS. A big welcome to those who are joining us for the first time today and those who are already familiar with the CASC's work. I am joined today by our communications manager, Jess Del Fiacco. A big thanks to Jess for joining this session, as well as our speaker, Madeline Nyblade, who we'll introduce in just a moment. As many of you may already know, especially if you've heard the spiel before, we use the acronym CASC for Climate Adaptation Science Center, and we'll be using that throughout the day's presentation. Please note that this presentation is being recorded. We will be posting the recording on our YouTube channel about a week or so after our event. So please make sure that you adjust your video settings accordingly and that you mute your microphones throughout the session, please. If at any point you've got questions, please go ahead and add them into the Zoom chat. We'll be watching that throughout the session. And that goes for whether it's logistical questions or questions for our presenter. So before we begin, Jess, can you flip to the next slide, please? Awesome, thank you. I'd like to take a very brief moment to share some background on the Midwest CASC for those of you who might not yet be familiar. And as a reminder to all of us, I think, for the importance of our regional collaborations that contribute to our research. The Midwest CASC is a partnership between the USGS and a consortium of the 8 institutions that you see here across the Midwest region. And we're hosted by the University of Minnesota in the Twin Cities. That's where Jess and I and several other folks working for this CASC are based. We're actually part of a national network of regional CASCs, all of which work to produce science that seeks to inform research management efforts to help fish, wildlife, water, land, and people adapt to a changing climate. And our focus in the Midwest, of course, is on research topics specific to our region. We accomplish our mission at the CASC in several primary ways, including conducting synthesis research on relevant regional priorities. We support a network of interns, graduate students, and postdoc fellows. We support the USGS-funded climate adaptation research projects. And we also host capacity building workshops and an annual convening of the Midwest CASC community. So speaking of, Jess, next slide, please. Our primary announcement today is, yes, it's next week. If you've happened to be on a science seminar or a newsletter over the past 6-8 months, you've been hearing us gear up to talk about our summer symposium. We are so excited and delighted to be hosting this at our consortium partner, University of Illinois, next week in Urbana-Champaign. Registration is still open, so feel free to go to that link that Jess just popped in the chat there if you haven't yet registered or if you've got questions about the agenda. And please go ahead and register for that symposium. I will call out too that this is a different landscape that we find ourselves in this summer, and we recognize that unfortunately not all of our partners are able to travel to the symposium. So if you are one of those partners that is unable to travel, there is a virtual registration option for you there. We strongly encourage you to come in person if you're able, but if you can't, we get it. And Jess will be in communication with you about the live streaming option we'll have for several of our sessions. We'll also be posting our keynotes on our YouTube channel after the event. Next slide, please, Jess. Thank you. Our other announcement today is we are delighted to welcome Sarah Anderson to the Midwest CASC. She is a new research project assistant with our team based here at University of Minnesota. I'm going to let Sarah just introduce herself briefly, and then I'll pass it over back to Jess to introduce our speaker for today. Sarah, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me? Okay, awesome. Hi, nice to meet you all. My name is Sarah Anderson, and so excited to join the CASC. I started about a month ago. It feels like just yesterday, though. I bring a background in biology, environmental studies, as well as a master's in horticulture here at the University of Minnesota. And in terms of work experience, my background is in environmental education and as well as corporate biodiversity assessments abroad in the Netherlands, and also various fieldwork opportunities in the Midwest here. So I'm excited to apply all of that here at the CASC and look forward to meeting some of you on a more personal level if you're joining at the Summer Symposium in Illinois. Nice to meet you all. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Sarah. Jess, I'll pass it over to you now to introduce our speaker.
Great. Thank you, Alyssa, and warm welcome to Sarah. We are so excited to have her on the team. And I have the pleasure of introducing today's speaker. Madeline Nyblade is joining us. She's an assistant professor in the Department of Environmental Studies at the State University of New York College of Environmental Science and Forestry. In her position there, she focuses on community-driven, community-based research to support caretaking, restoration, and conservation of our shared environments. Prior to taking on this position, Madeline worked on a Midwest CASC-funded research project, and we're delighted to have her back to share some of that research today. So Madeline, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hand the show over to you.
Thank you so much. And thanks for that introduction. And it's great to see all of you on the call. I see familiar names, some new names. As Jess mentioned, I did complete my PhD at the University of Minnesota on a graduate fellowship funded through the CASC. So it's exciting to be able to present to you all some of the work. Is the screen sharing the right one and you're all good?
Yep, looks good.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'll start off by saying I'm currently on Haudenosaunee lands, homelands of the Onondaga Nation. I live and work in Syracuse right now, but did all of this work in Minnesota when I was living in Minneapolis on Dakota homelands, and working in close collaboration with several Ojibwe nations and intertribal organizations. Again, this work was funded by the CASC, as well as other partners. And so it's been really a pleasure to do this work in support of wild rice, which is also known as monomen in Ojibwe and Sing in Dakota. And so my work really focuses on the impacts of climate change and land cover change on wild rice in partnership with Ojibwe nations and Dakota nations. I want to give a huge shout out to the team of folks who have been a part of this work. Many are pictured here and many more have been part of this project prior to even me joining. And then also since I've left, the work continues and there's so many dedicated individuals who invest in this project and build relationships to sustain this partnership between the University of Minnesota researchers and tribal and intertribal organizations. I'm going to walk through an overview of my talk that also parallels the life cycle of monomen, so you can also learn a little bit about monomen as we go here. I will use monomen and Pasing interchangeably, mostly using monomen since my focus of my work has been on Ojibwe homelands, but also use Pasing, the Dakota word, when talking in relation to Dakota people. So hopefully you can follow with me as I use all of these different words. So I'll start by grounding the work in the values that guide our partnership. I see values as seeds, the foundation, guiding forces that grow our partnership. So the seeds of monomen start growing roots underneath the ice in April, and these values take root and take shape through our relationships. And so I'll talk a bit about how relationships ground this work. From these relationships, we can share understandings and come to understand each other's worldview and perspectives and grow new projects and questions and new directions for research. And this is paralleled paralleling the seedling stage of monomen where monomen is starting to grow below the water surface, reaching upwards, starting to grow into more knowledge and understanding. This is a long stage for monomen, and it's really important, and we'll talk about this, the seedling growth, just as it takes a lot of work and time to build these shared understandings. By mid-June, monomen has reached the surface of the water level in the floating leaf stage, so it has a long leaf resting on the surface of the water. I see this stage as really pivotal for both the growth of monomen and then also the stage of partnership development, where we have these shared understandings and then co-developing research questions. And how we co-develop those research questions and really making sure that the tribal partner's priorities are centered in those questions really shapes the trajectory of the research project, just as monomen in this floating leaf stage is very sensitive and its experiences during this stage can really shape the trajectory of the growth. By mid-July, monomen has emerged out of the water. So that is where monomen is right now. It has purple flowers. It's wind pollinated. I see this paralleling the methods of our research project, where we are learning from each other and employing methods within our own knowledge systems. So from my position as a Western trained research scientist who has grown up surrounded in the Western science world, I'm non-native, grew up in Pennsylvania. I ground myself in Western methods, but then also learning from my Indigenous partners on Indigenous research methodologies and allowing for that cross-pollination of ideas to really lean into that wind pollination metaphor and stage of monomen here. By the end of August, monomen is ready to harvest. The seeds are ready to harvest. And I see this paralleling the results, the nuggets of information that come out of this research project together. But importantly, those results need to be understood in context, in relationship to each other, and celebrated and shared. So following harvest of monomen, it's important to celebrate and share with feasting and celebrating within our work and sharing that knowledge. And so I see this research presentation today as part of that, sharing the wisdom and what we've learned from this project with you all. And then importantly, monomen is an annual plant, and so these seeds return to the lake bed and lie dormant over the winter below the ice. So there's always this period of rest, and seeds can stay dormant for multiple years waiting for the right conditions. And so I see this as an integral part of our process of building relationships, is also having that time for rest and reflection and learning from how we have been moving in the past. So now that you know a little bit about where we're going with this project and this talk, and a little bit about the life cycle of monomen, I'm going to jump into sharing some background and the values that ground this work. So monomen Psing, its range is extensive. This is a map here from a modeled data set showing density locations for monomen. So we have Zizania palustris, which is northern wild rice, which is mostly what I'm talking about. But then there's also Zizania aquatica, so southern wild rice. And then we have Zizania texana, which is a relative that grows in Texas. And so you can see that monomen palustris, northern wild rice, is really centered in Minnesota and Wisconsin by this yellow color here. But it has a wide-reaching range. And you can also see that it grows in New York, or what we call New York today, which is where I live currently. And so at the very end of this talk, I'll share a little bit about some of the work I'm doing to continue my relationship with wild rice and working with Haudenosaunee nations around reconnecting with wild rice and where we might be able to go with that. Zizania aquatica is more along the coastal regions and is also present in the south of what we now call the United States. But Zizania palustris and Zizania aquatica does have an overlapping range. This area is also home to indigenous nations. Oceti-Sakowin territory, the Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota people call this land home, as well as the Anishinaabe people, the Odawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi people, and many, many more indigenous peoples. And I've been learning more from Haudenosaunee nations about their relationships with Mahnomen and harvesting it, but also trading for it with Ojibwe nations. And as we all know, this is not just home to Mahnomen and indigenous nations. We are also present within this settler nation of the United States. This is a map of the ceded territories that from the U.S. Forest Service of land ceded to the United States by indigenous nations, just to represent this settler nation that is also present here. So if we are to zoom in on the heartlands, the homelands of Mahnomen in the Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, Upper Great Lakes area, also into Canada, what we now call Canada, we can see that there's an overlapping area of indigenous lands, ceded territories, state lands, and so on. So some background on land cession treaties in this Upper Great Lakes region between the United States and indigenous nations. This is a depiction of the years that each land cession treaty was signed and with which nation was signed across this region. These relationships these treaties were between the United States and sovereign indigenous nations. And tribes are sovereign nations. They were prior to the United States existing, and they continue to remain sovereign. And so these treaties are nation-to-nation agreements. This sovereignty is deeply tied to the land. And you can see that in the continued practice of Dakota and Ojibwe nations in maintaining and stewarding this relationship with Pising and Mahnomen. This is a photo of traditional harvesting in the Prairie Island Indian community, and then also a photo of parching, a process within processing wild rice from the Lac du Flambeau Nation. Mahnomen is the cultural foundation and sacred relative for the Ojibwe peoples. It is part of their migration story and has been an integral part of who they are as a people. And you can see some photos here from the different life stages of Mahnomen that I've already gone over. This old black and white photo is of a traditional practice of bundling to mark community or family areas for harvesting, as well as protect Mahnomen from being the seeds from being blown off the stalks during a windstorm. And then I also want to point out this big photo here is from Fond du Lac. And you can see that when Mahnomen is in abundance, it is in abundance. It covers a whole lake. So this green area is wild rice. This is Perch Lake. And so you can really see how this sacred relative has provided so much nutrients and sustenance and supporting the Ojibwe lifeways, and how integral it is to the Ojibwe people, and how prolific it is and has been across the region. Pising is also a sacred food and medicine for the Dakota. I have had the privilege of paddling with folks at Prairie Island to some of their restoration sites on the Mississippi backwaters where Pising is returning, primarily Zizania aquatica, which is the southern variety of wild rice that's really tall. And so we were able to go out and paddle with Zizania aquatica. I think this was 2023. Importantly, these ceded territories, so the land ceded from indigenous nations to the United States, many of these treaties emphasize that Ojibwe nations maintain the rights to gathering wild rice off of their reservations. So Ojibwe nations maintain rights outside of their reservations that protect wild rice. This is just one example from the Treaty of 1837. And another important piece that situates this work is that I was a graduate student at the University of Minnesota. The University of Minnesota was funded by and contributed to Indigenous land dispossession. It also contributed to and supported research that led to Mahnomen Pising habitat degradation. and wild rice cultivation genetics research, with all done without the full consent of tribal nations. And so this set of background information that I'm laying out here, I hope gives you a sense of the political environment that this work is being done in, and that has informed how we structure our values and our partnership for doing this work, recognizing that there's this long history of harm done by the University of Minnesota on the Indigenous nations, and working towards a better relationship through this project. So I see the values as grounding this research project, and then pulling in different ways of knowing and research methods to support our shared research goals. And this is really drawing from approaches by other Indigenous scholars, Dr. Kyle White, Dr. Robin Wall Kimmerer, in thinking about how mainstream or Western science can be in support of tribal nation goals. Thinking about Robin Wall Kimmerer's metaphor of the garden, of the Three Sisters garden, where you have traditional ecological knowledge, or the Indigenous environmental science held within Indigenous nations as the guiding scaffold for the research, the corn that is leading the process, and then the Western science as the beans that provide a lot of really useful tools, fixing nitrogen in this metaphor, but is wiry and can go a lot of different directions and needs that guiding force of traditional knowledge. And then the squash shades the garden, shades out other weeds to create a space where this collaboration can flourish. And so from the guidance of these Indigenous scholars and thinking about how we can bring different ways of knowing together, we have come together with shared values, enacted those shared values through community practices that allow us to come to understandings that we can then generate research questions and collaboration. And then from the research collaboration, have chosen methods that align with and address the research questions from our various worldviews and various disciplines and knowledge systems to then address those questions. And so from this collaboration, we have identified grounding values of humility, reciprocity, personal connection, interrelatedness, spirit, and healing that are the core of how we move forward in this project. And from those values, we put them into action through ceremony, visiting each other in the field, regular meetings, having memorandum of understanding, mentoring students, Indigenous and allied students, and hosting workshops. And as I'm speaking, I'm also realizing so much of this work is now continuing and I am not there. So, so much of this is being carried on in continuation, and recognizing that I'm speaking to my specific time as part of this project. So here are some photos from my time on this research project, of being out in the field, of sharing, of having workshops. Many Zoom meetings. And then also importantly, going out and harvesting wild rice with our partners. One thing I really want to emphasize is that we have memorandum of understanding between the University of Minnesota and the tribal partners. And this is a very brief overview, but you can see a full document as part of our 2021 publication. Importantly, we have protocol for data ownership and sharing to respect Indigenous data sovereignty. And so all of this relationship work has resulted in the larger collaborative now called Kawe Gada Nanaga Dawendamin Minomin, which translates to first we must consider wild rice, recognizing and calling researchers and everyone part of this project to center wild rice in all of the work that we do and make sure that we are in alignment of protecting this important and sacred relative. And we have many partners across the region and have sites that we have studied with those partners based on their priorities. And from our process of working together, we have developed this flow of annual cycle of collaborating based off of fieldwork and sharing data. So first we have fieldworks going out, measuring water levels, temperature, wild rice abundance, processing that data back at the lab, and then creating preliminary analyses, graphs of, this is a graph of water levels, and then sharing all of that data back with all of the partners that we are working with through draft reports, and then having a bunch of discussions about the graphs and the data that we're finding, and coming to a more shared understanding of what's happening, what are the questions that are emerging, what are unknowns and interesting avenues to pursue through that collaboration. So very iterative process. And through all of these dialogues, our conception, and I'm speaking primarily from the scientist perspective here, in the university scientists' understanding of the Monoman system has changed, and we can see that through the different conceptual models that we've built over time. So by collaborating with tribal partners, we have fundamentally shifted the research that we are doing to center tribal priorities and then also deepen our understanding of Monoman. And so just to show how this understanding has changed, the first research focus that was driving this work before my time on this project was really looking at the impacts of sulfate on wild rice, a known toxin. And so there was a lot of biogeochemistry questions. And then from working with Indigenous nations and hearing more priorities and concerns and learning more about Monoman from the partnering nations, we learned about the many other aspects of Monoman habitat that Monoman needs to be healthy and grow, including the impacts of storms and winters and available nutrients and so on. And of course, as we continued to explore the system, it got more and more complex, and there were many other beings interfacing and relating to this Monoman habitat. And we're thinking about how muskrats, carp, waterfowl impact herbivory, thinking about beavers impacting water levels, and so on. And then importantly, we also heard again and again the importance of climate change and how that was impacting Monoman. And we can see that in the Gliffwick vulnerability assessment and the 1854 Treaty Authority vulnerability assessment, and thinking about how climate change is changing winters, changing storms, changing water levels to impact Monoman. And of course, it's not just this biophysical side, it's also thinking about how people have shaped this environment, how colonization and this land use change has shaped the Monoman habitat and affected Monoman's health. And of course, it's not also just negative impacts that humans provide to Monoman. There's also so many caretaking strategies we see from the different Indigenous nations and tribes involved, and also some that the state, the Wisconsin and Minnesota DNR are picking up as well. And so from all of this collaboration, we started to see how complex and interconnected this whole system was for all the things interacting to support or harm Monoman health. And it wasn't just this one specific angle that we needed to take for this research, which is also very daunting for someone who's grounded in Western science, where what we do is we reduce and we look at one specific thing and reduce all the other variables. And so I was showing this figure back to our partners as part of our iterative process, and got the feedback that this was useful in some contexts, but largely did not speak to the Ojibwe worldview. And so I worked with Bazile Panik, Red Cliff Band of Lake Superior Chippewa, and he led the work of reframing this in an Ojibwe worldview based on the medicine wheel, which is a teaching found in many Indigenous cultures, but he grounded it in Ojibwe teachings from around the medicine wheel that have many layers of meanings for each of the 4 directions. We start in the east, the spring, infant are all aspects of this direction, and then we move to the south. Youth and summer are associated with this direction, and then the fall, the west, the adult, and then the winter and the elder direction in the north. And so he adapted this model to represent Monoman in this way. At the center, we have Monoman's Minobabadaziwin, Monoman's good life. And then each of the directions have a different aspect that supports Monoman good life. And you can see from this that it's not this interconnected, messy web, the way that I had depicted this, Instead, there are these in what more clear and defined areas in support of Monoman's good life. And I've come to see this as one example of different ways that different worldviews see this complex ecosystem. I was shocked that there wasn't a messy amount of lines in Bazile's original or in his medicine wheel. And I think that my initial shock, and now that I've done some reflecting on that, was reflecting, it was because I was grounded in a Western worldview. And so I really wanted to show how everything was interconnected, because the assumption within the Western mainstream worldview is that things are not interconnected, though mainstream ecology and sciences are changing that as well. But I really wanted to emphasize that everything was interconnected. So I drew all of those lines out. But from an Ojibwe worldview, it is inherently understood that everything is interconnected. So that wasn't as important for Bazile to show in this medicine wheel, where we have Menominee, people who harvest wild rice in the east, Gadinawe Magdamin, all of our relations in the south, Aki, earth, land, or ground in the west, and then Menomin itself in the north. Menomin as the elder and the teacher leading this work. And so I've come to see them as potentially two sides to what I like to think of as embroidery, potentially as a metaphor, where this is the organized side, and then my model is the backside of embroidery, or maybe of a unskilled embroidery piece that is very messy and chaotic, but both share different truths about the system and have value and come together to help us see and work across difference. And so I felt like this is really well captured by our project partner, Joe Gravine, that when we look at this medicine wheel model of Menomin's Minobabadaziwin, we can see that Western science is really just looking at a slice of this whole picture when we do standard mainstream Western science and we isolate variables and we miss this broader picture. So to Joe, Western science is like slicing a pickle or a cucumber to study something. You miss the whole broader picture. And so my work, I recognize, has different questions and different slices, and also have worked to bring it back in context with this whole medicine wheel to understand this whole system or contribute to our understanding of this whole system. And right away, you can see that my study, this medicine wheel points out a glaring gap, which is all our relations. I have not looked at other beings in relationship to Menomin, and that this medicine wheel calls us to do that work and recognize that that is missing from what I'm about to share. But so my research has focused on how Menomin is changing across the region. What are the impacts to harvesters? How do we take care of Menomin? And then what are the impacts of climate and land use change? And these questions, again, came from that collaborative process. The first hypothesis was that there is a significant decline of Menomin across the region, and this was shared with us from harvesters and some of the preliminary data we were looking at. But we also recognize that it's really complicated to determine overall abundance because of this natural cycles and abundance of about 4 years with known within traditional ecological knowledge. And so this is a picture of the same lake 3 different years, and you can see the wildly different amounts of abundance. Our second hypothesis is that we would see greater Menomin density with more snow and lower winter temperatures. This is again coming directly from tribal partner observations that noted that there's often more Menomin the year following a winter that is colder with more snow, and also with greater ice duration. We also heard about how sensitive wild rice is at the floating leaf stage, and that it needs lower water levels at that floating leaf stage so that it takes less energy for it to grow to that surface, and that benefits Menomin later in the fall. And so if we're thinking about lower water levels during that floating leaf stage, we're thinking about less precipitation at that time. And then drawing from mainstream ecology, we also looked at and thought that warmer seasons, more days above 4 degrees Celsius would provide more growing time, and so we would see more monomen. We also looked at the changes with land use. So we hypothesized that we would see greater abundance with less development, more evergreen forests, and less agricultural area in the watershed. And then also to tie this all together, and because we had data on tribal harvest, we also hypothesized that we would see greater tribal harvest with increased monomen abundance. While this is fairly straightforward and comes directly from experience that when there's more monomen, you can harvest more, we wanted to show this with the numbers as well. So to answer these questions and test out these hypotheses, I pulled together data from a large number of sources. And I want to call out that the tribal nations have been monitoring monomen for decades. And this is an extensive amount of time and resource commitment. It is one way you can clearly see how important this resource is, this relative is to the indigenous nations, that they've been surveying monomen for decades, since the 80s and 90s, and have this long-term record. I also used lake ice records, and I want to acknowledge the folks that have done an extensive amount of work to maintain those lake ice records. One of them is from the Trout Lake Research Station at the University of Wisconsin. So big shout out to all of the folks who've maintained these long data sets. Has been really helpful for my work. So really grateful for them. So to jump into the data, we can see from these abundant surveys, just by looking at the raw numbers, you can see this variability and you can see this general decline. So each of the colors here is a different lake. On the x-axis, we have time, and then on the y-axis, we have the total number of stocks in each lake. We have the 1854 Treaty Authority at the top, which is the northern part of the Northern Arrowhead region of Minnesota, Fond du Lac, and then the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission, which is northern Wisconsin. Their study lakes are in northern, what we now call northern Wisconsin. I also did an analysis of the periodicity of these cycles, and it did show that roughly 2/3 of them have this multi-year cycle, which directly parallels the traditional ecological knowledge of this 4-year cycle. I use generalized additive models to look at the overall trends. I chose this type of modeling because it accounts for or allows for this inherent variability, and allows me to look at multiple variables at the same time. So it was a tool that allowed me to honor the complexity that I was hearing from our partners was so important to each of these places, reflected in that messy spaghetti diagram. But then also try to use the tools of Western science to pull out those nuggets of information that might be helpful. Looking across these longer term data sets, we see a decline of roughly 5 to 7% per year across both the 1854 Treaty Authority data and the Glyphwick data. These both had slightly different methods for sampling. And so one of the arguments that I make in this work is that there are flaws to different methods of sampling, but these two show consistent trends. And so that adds to the strength of this decline across the region, of understanding that decline. We also have data on harvest from Wisconsin, from the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission. And we do see that there is a decline in tribal harvest on off-reservation lakes, but there's no decline within non-tribal harvest. This data, happy to answer more questions about the harvest data if they come up. I then looked at the relationship of this abundance data with weather, with climate data. And I looked at each of the life stages of monomen in relation to the variables and hypotheses that we pulled out. So the gray here shows the confidence level. The blue here is the 1854 Treaty Authority data. The orange is the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission data. Each of these columns is a different life stage. So when we're looking at precipitation during this submerged stage, so when monomen is below the water, we see that there is a positive relationship in water level and monomen. or this curved relationship, but we see this strong negative relationship. So when you have increased precipitation and down here you have increased water level, you have a negative impact on the monomen density that fall. We didn't see much relationship with precipitation or water level in the emergent stage. And then there's a slight positive relationship with snow. We also see significant relationships with temperature, ice, and monomen density. I have a summary slide, so for the sake of time, I'll jump past these graphs. But in collection, our results show that we see less monomen abundance with less snow, less ice, higher winter temperature means, more precipitation during that floating leaf stage, and higher water levels in the floating leaf stage, and more days above 4 degrees Celsius. So all of these factors negatively impact monomen abundance. And if we compare that with anthropogenic climate change, and predictions for the future, we see that the climate is moving in the direction that is least favorable for monomen. So we have a 50% reduction of snow, less ice, warmer winters, increased precipitation, especially during that early summer, late spring time when monomen is in the floating leaf stage. And so overall, we can see the climate and the anthropogenic climate change is moving towards conditions that are harsher for monomen to grow. To jump to the land use stage, part of my work, I focus on climate change because that was a question that emerged from our tribal partners. But as I did this work and began also collaborating with some Dakota nations, I heard again and again that climate change is just one piece of this, that climate change is layered on top of 500 years of colonization that has substantially changed the landscape. And so we have to see these two things in relationship, that climate change is happening on top of a fundamentally changed landscape. And so also looking at how watersheds and land use has changed across the region. I pulled in more data sets to do this work, and this is something that I want to continue to expand across a larger region of the whole Great Lakes as well. But some of the key findings we were pulling out was that there is a negative relationship between agricultural area and monomen abundance. We see some negative and some positive relationships with urban areas, which could be a function of the data that we're using, or it could also mean that there are some positive relationship between people and monomen that we don't quite understand in our data. There's a negative relationship with the number of dams in a watershed and monomen abundance, and we do see a positive relationship with evergreen forest cover in a watershed. And if we look at how land has changed since colonization, we can see that there's a huge number of dams, 5,710 dams approximately across this region. There's been a 60 to 97% decline in forests in each of the different ceded territories, and this is also a loss of evergreen stands exacerbated by fire suppression. And we also see this large decrease in grassland prairies as well. And so from this, we can also see that underneath that threat from climate change, we also have this land use change that is negatively impacting monomen. To jump to the impacts to harvesters, we have increased density relates positively to pounds harvested per trip by tribal members. So on the x-axis here, we have stock density, so how dense the monomen stand is. And then on the y-axis, we have the impact on the pounds per trip for each tribal harvester. And we can see that up to about 200 stocks per square meter, there's a positive effect. And then there's a pretty large error and range, but a kind of a declining effect. And from experience, I can say that once you get really, really dense monomen, so 300 stocks per square meter, it's pretty hard to pull through. And so that might be one of the reasons why we see this decline at really high densities. So to summarize these takeaways, we see that monomen being available for harvest is declining across the region, and that's accounting for all the complexity and the variation between years, and that this is in part related to land cover and climate change. We also see that climate change will continue to negatively impact monomen density, and then because there's this relationship between monomen density and tribal harvest, decreased monomen density results in less pounds of monomen harvested. But as I said earlier, our partners have really helped us emphasize that not just seeing the human-monoman relationship as a negative one, and also thinking about the positive impact people can have on stewarding and caring for this sacred relative. And if you look at the average pounds harvested in the previous 2 years compared to the present year, you actually see a positive relationship, potentially indicating that past harvest can support present harvest as one way of stewarding monoman into the future, given this land cover and climate change threats that are ongoing and have been a big problem in the past. And through all of this work, I had the privilege of working with many different agencies and tribal nations and intertribal organizations who are doing tremendous work to take care of monoman in the facing these large threats. And there are so many ways we can continue to steward monoman. And so hopefully this is not leaving everyone with, it is really sad and hard to realize the decline of monoman and the threats that are happening, but also recognize there's actions that can be taken to support this sacred relative. Some of those actions include tribal management and collaboration, harvesting in a respectful way, following tribal protocols, reseeding efforts, bundling rice. I showed a picture of bundling rice early on. That could be a way to protect rice from these late season storms, controlling water levels or adjusting water levels through removing dams or adjusting control structures. There's an example of that at Lake Ogeechee. Clearing outlets, so lowering water levels by clearing outlets, managing beaver dams, restoring a good relationship with beaver, thinking about their role in water level management, removing competitive vegetation like pickerel weed, mixing up sediment, bringing the seeds that are farther down to the surface, exclosing areas from herbivores like geese, stewarding our forests, changing agricultural practices, preventing pollution and known contamination, all an effort to protect what's left. And so this work has been a huge collaboration, and we've had a wonderful time also sharing back and getting feedback on this work and iterating on this continued process, and been able to share with the Monoman Sing Knowledge Symposium in 2023 and at national conferences, and recognizing that this work has also been a way of starting to work towards justice and healing between the University of Minnesota and Ojibwe nations, and maybe between Western mainstream philosophies and Indigenous Ojibwe knowledges as well. So to summarize, we see this regional decline about 6 to 7% per year, complicated by multi-year cycles. It's caused in part by climate and land use change, which has reduced off-reservation harvests. But humans can restore and care for monoman as Indigenous nations are doing and have always done. And so in the last moment here, I'll just share how I'm continuing this work or thinking about this work where I am now in Haudenosaunee homelands. As I showed in the very beginning, Monoman Sing wild rice grows across the Great Lakes region. I've been working with Dr. Catherine Landis, who has done this extensive historical ecology of the central New York region and pulled together literature on the historical accounts of wild rice growing in central New York. Two of the examples are here. And if we look at that model, we do see, and historical records, locations where wild rice, both Zizania aquatica and palustris, so the northern and southern wild rice, grow around the southern Great Lakes region. And so I've been exploring these areas, and we actually found both Zizania aquatica and Zizania palustris in the Lakeview Wildlife Management Area last fall, and went out and got to know monoman out here and harvested a little bit of wild rice and processed it. And so we're excited to continue this work, and we've been sharing this with our partners at the Onondaga Nation, and we've actually had some folks from the Cayuga Nation who've been interested in restoring wild rice in a little like west central New York on the Finger Lake area. So this is an active area that I'm continuing, and would love to continue my relationship and collaboration with folks in the Midwest, the Midwest Cask, and folks stewarding wild rice on this work. And so with that, I'll say miigwech, thank you. I'm happy to take any questions. Yeah, so I'll end there.
Thanks so much, Maddie. Great presentation, incredible work that you and partners are doing. We've got a couple questions that have come into the chat. The first one is about, I think, the graph that showed growth levels in different lakes, asking what the blue bar was in an 1854 treaty map, I think, or that was the source.
Yes.
It's okay. You don't have to go back to that. You're not going to be able to tell from your slides, probably.
The bigger lake that is Big Rice Lake.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, Big Rice Lake has seen a big decline in Mahnomen. It used to be a really productive wild rice lake, really important to everyone in that area. But they've seen a really surprising decline, and has made a big impact.
And then there's another question in the chat. What trends did you find in the number of tribal harvesters?
Yeah, so I just looked at general declines, and I looked at their pounds harvested per trip. There's a lot of complications with that data, so I wasn't able to dig too much into it, but we did see that there was a general decline. But I'd love to do more in understanding declines in harvesting. And I know May Davenport has been working with Lac du Flambeau to do their own harvester survey for their nation, and there's some other research going on about that. So definitely a good question.
If anyone would like to ask a question directly, feel free to raise your hand or just go off mute. And then you're welcome to put things in the chat as well.
Yeah, hi, my name is Cecilia Calvo. I work at Rainbow Research. And I just wanted to, Maddie, say thank you so much for your presentation. I learned a lot and was very interested in your, I guess, the methodology and approach to the research of just working how you worked in partnership with Indigenous community members and leaders to shape your research questions, and how you talked about how that really kind of shifted or you know, it was a partnership to shape to identify those questions that led the research. And so that was just an exciting piece to learn about. And
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, that's been a huge part of this work. And I think whenever I give this talk, I'm always like, I should, spend more time on the graphs. But then I end up talking like for most of it about the partnership. Because that is so important, and is how we got to the research questions and got to the information and the knowledge that we were able to create together, is because of that information and shared understandings that were only possible through collaboration. The research questions started off about sulfate contamination, and have moved in so many more to look at more complex interconnected dynamics that were really in response to tribal observations and priorities. Yeah, and then also in terms of choosing what method I used to analyze the data was definitely informed by this need to account for that variability and recognize the complexity as much as possible, recognizing that mainstream statistics is a very reductive form of knowledge creation, but it definitely informed how I was going to employ statistics to answer these questions. And then also just that the tribal nations have these long-term data sets is remarkable. Just this incredible amount of work that it takes to build a long-term monitored data set. And also the long-term observations of harvesters being out in the water with Mahnomen year after year and seeing these relationships that directly informed what we tested with the statistical tools. So there's so many ways that the partnership enabled this research to even happen. I can answer some of the questions in the chat. Herbivory was not considered in this model. As I mentioned, one of the things that this study is lacking is that I did not do any consideration. I did not have any consideration of other beings and their relationship with monomen. And so I would highly suggest, and I know that that work is being done by others of looking at those relationships, but herbivory has been a big player, especially in some lakes impacting monomen. What are some of the tribal cultural losses associated with the decline in production? Yeah, that's a really good question. Monomen is a sacred food relative being in support of Ojibwe cultural lifeways. It's central to ceremonies and practices. It is incredibly healthy to eat. And so losses, there are so many cultural losses. There's a really great study done by Fond du Lac that documents some of the health and cultural well-being aspects that monomen supports that can really help understand what it means to lose monomen. I can try to dig that up and put that in the chat, but highly recommend looking into that. So the other question is, what are the my take on restoration efforts to amend and reverse the trend of the loss of monomen? Yeah, I guess one of my thoughts on this is that one of the things I've been really hopeful and surprised and in awe of is that how every Indigenous nation seems to be taking a different approach to this. And then also their partnerships with different state or local caretaking agencies have different approaches. And so there are so many different essentially experiments going on across the region of what works. And then also recognizing that each lake has its own local dynamics that are at play. Some cases it's herbivory is the driving threat, others it's water levels, and then oftentimes it's a combination. And so these local relationships and all of these different management strategies, I think if we continue to come together and share and learn about all of the practices going on, I have confidence that this community of stewards can find ways to reverse this trend and care for monomen in the face of climate change. But there are so many different types of practices. So I don't have one answer to that question, but my hope lies in the fact that I've met so many passionate people who are trying and trying out many different strategies to support monomen caretaking. And we need real action to also stop the land use change that is threatening monomen and polluting waters to protect what is left as well.
Thank you again, Maddie, for a great presentation. Thank you to everybody who joined us today. I'm going to wrap us up as we are at the top of the hour. Before you go, I'm going to launch a quick poll. We would really appreciate your response there to tell us how we did today and how we can do even better with these seminars. Our next seminar is going to be September 29th. I hope you'll join us there. It's going to be about climate impacts on butterfly populations in the Midwest. But with that, thank you all so much. Enjoy the rest of your Mondays. And thank you again, Maddie, for your time today.
Thank you all.